So this is Love, chapter 26. To his dismay, Ferdinand was not invited to dinner. He blamed Genevieve. Brimming with the information that magic had returned to Aurelius, he waited for the king to return to his chambers. But when the opportunity finally arrived, the guards at the door stopped him from entering. The king is asleep, your grace. He is not to be disturbed. The duke sniffed. I have important, urgent news for his majesty. We were given specific orders, your grace. I'm afraid I cannot let you pass. This is important. Ferdinand wedged himself between the guards, ignoring their protests and attempts to stop him, and barged through into the king's bedchambers. Your majesty, he cried, drawing the long velvet curtains that bathed the king's bedroom in darkness. He shook George's arm, hovering over him as the king stirred. Sire, I have urgent news. King George rolled over in his bed, then threw a pillow over his head. Ferdinand, confounded man, I have asked not to be disturbed. Go away. That's an order. But, your majesty, the prince has found the mysterious maiden. At this news, the king shot up on his bed. This is cause for celebration. Quick, quick, she... You'd best listen to my report first, interrupted the Grand Duke, lighting the candle at the king's bedside. What is it? I don't have all day. It's the girl, said Ferdinand curtly. It appears that your son, the prince, has uncovered her identity, and... He paused for effect. And? Repeated the king. From your tone, I'll take it you aren't pleased. Let me guess, she's a baroness. No, a merchant's daughter. A mysterious heiress? She's a servant, Ferdinand said flatly. A servant? George leaned back, stroking his chin. A dry, hacking sound escaped him, and Ferdinand couldn't tell whether it was a laugh or a cough. Now that is unexpected. Ferdinand struggled to conceal his frustration. The king was beginning to sound increasingly like his sister. My question to you, sire, is what do we do about it? The prince is intent on marrying her, but as you know, this cannot be. She's not only a servant, but also an orphan. Why should that matter? Ferdinand threw up his arms. Because the prince plans to ask for your permission to marry her. He has it. Ferdinand's jaw went slack. This was wholly unacceptable. But, enough, Ferdinand. You wrote the proclamation yourself, didn't you? King George shoved a copy of it under the Duke's face. Said noble prince will, upon bended knee, beg, request, or if need be, implore said maiden that he be granted her hand in marriage, whereupon should the aforementioned maiden look with favor upon his suit, then shall she happily couple pledge their truth. And in due course, finished Ferdinand, upon the inevitable demise of his most gracious and august majesty, the king, succeed to the throne, there no rule over all the land, as king and queen of our beloved kingdom. The inevitable demise. Ferdinand's thoughts lingered on the phrase, and he recalled how he'd ignored it. It was a standard line, one that normally concluded decrees of such nature. Besides, reports from Dr. Coast always stated that though George's health was weaker than before, it was in no perilous state. Nothing was amiss. That had been as Ferdinand had wanted it. But ever since the blasted ball, now the wording snagged Ferdinand's attention. It was he, the Grand Duke, who should rule Aurelius upon George's passing, not the prince and his scullery maid. It would have been fine if Charles had the decency to marry one of the foreign princesses Ferdinand had selected, but a maid and one with a fairy godmother? As always, Ferdinand would have to take matters into his own hands. The king wouldn't understand how dangerous the girl was. He'd have to exaggerate her story, fabricate a background for her, a sorceress, yes. That he would tell King George that the maid practiced dark magic. That, if anything, would get his majesty's attention. When the king wasn't looking, Ferdinand patted one of his side pockets of his trousers, making sure that he'd tucked inside what was still there. Something would be amiss, and soon. A son of mine can't renege on his promises, went on King George. Besides, the ballroom's already decorated for a party. We'll have the wedding tomorrow. No, today. The king's inattention grated on Ferdinand. Patience, he reminded himself. Eliminate the root of the threat. But I haven't finished, he said, waiting to reveal his trump card. What do you mean? If only you'd listen to reason, sire, he lamented. I knew the prince had fallen in love unnaturally quickly. Ferdinand leaned closer to the king's bedside. The mysterious maiden enchanted him, and that is why the poor young man hasn't been able to think straight since he met her. She cast a spell on him. Oh, for heaven's sake, Ferdinand, this has gone on long enough. King George suppressed a cough. I know you dislike the idea of Charles marrying a commoner, but these are modern times. This is hardly enough reason to wake me from my rest. It's true, Your Majesty. I heard it from the girl's lips myself. Ferdinand seized a nearby chair and shifted it close to the king's bed. He lowered his voice. She admitted to having magic. That was why she left the ball so suddenly. The king wasn't listening anymore. Come, help me get dressed. Is she in the palace? Have someone fetch her. Listen to me, Your Majesty. You haven't even met the girl. She could be a sorceress. The king let out a shallow laugh. If she's cast a spell over my son, then so be it. She can have him. Sire, don't keep siring me. King George let out another cough and cleared his throat, looking aggravated. She could be practicing dark magic. If she were, you wouldn't bother telling me. She would be in the dungeon by now. This was true, and Ferdinand cursed his luck that the king was in a mood of reason. Regrettably, it meant Ferdinand needed to resort to his backup scheme. Are you quite well, Your Majesty? He asked, putting on his most concerned voice. Perhaps you should have some tonic for your cough. Bah, tonics are useless. Pass me my sleeping draught. Where is it? Are you blind, Ferdinand? It's behind you, on my desk. Dribble a bit into my tea, just a pinch now. I don't want to fall asleep immediately. Surreptitiously, the Grand Duke turned his back to the king and reached into his pocket for a vial of his own, a little something he'd commissioned from a trusted pharmacist. It was stronger than his past requests, far stronger. But the pharmacist hadn't even asked what it was for. Everyone trusted Ferdinand, with good reason too, who had helped run Aurelius after the queen had passed, leaving King George overcome with grief, who had attended every council meeting and kept that court together whenever the nobles quarreled. Forcing his shaky hand to steady, he slipped a delicate dash of his vial's contents into the king's draught, then a quick splash of the sleeping draught to mask the bitterness. An invisible thread of guilt tightened around his neck, and he tugged at his collar uncomfortably. Sometimes a bit of unpleasantness was necessary for the good of the kingdom. If this business about His Majesty abdicating soon was true, Ferdinand would have to call upon a secret assembly of his most loyal supporters to propose the amendment to the law that he'd been working on, one that would place him in power, not Prince Charles. He'd have a few days at most. He would have to work quickly. Here you are, sire. The king poured the mixture down his throat with a grumble. Despicable stuff, I tell you. Couldn't they make this taste better? Taste is insignificant if it'll improve your health, sire. Bah! What do these doctors know? They tell me what I want to hear. That I'll be around to see my grandchildren. My great-grandchildren, George snorted. Quacks, a lot of them. I'll be lucky if I see the boy married at this point. You mustn't talk like that, Your Majesty. I will talk however I please, the king roared, only to fall into another coughing fit. Once he recovered, he sighed. This kingdom could use a little magic. I could use a little magic. Your Majesty, listen to yourself, pleaded the Duke. Magic has expressly been forbidden. That was my father's recommendation in your law, for good reason, too. Think of how dangerous it can be, wielded by someone with evil intentions. Yes, but maybe if we hadn't forbidden magic, we wouldn't have to worry about the war with our neighbors or within our own country. Charles wouldn't even have to consider marrying a foreign princess. And with that, the Duke hid a smile. He took out his monocle and pretended to clean it, a habit he was expressly aware he indulged in whenever he needed to deliberate before speaking. He pulled his chair closer to the king's bedside, patiently waiting for his concoction to take effect. I was listening during the council, said George. People are angry with me for not making Aurelius a fairer place for them to live. There isn't much I can do for them now, but Charles will right my wrongs, and I will help him, Your Majesty. A pause, if he lets me. The king trusted him, depended on him. If Charles were to rise to the throne soon, the Grand Duke shuddered at the reality of it. He would lose years of hard work and decades of manipulating the king into depending on him for guidance on how to rule Aurelius. Ferdinand needed to strategize his next moves very carefully, and he'd been with the secret assembly of his most trusted men. Prince Charles certainly wouldn't listen to him, the way his father did. At first, Ferdinand had resigned himself to the young prince going off to university. Maybe Charles would come back ready to listen to the men with far more tact and experience at running the kingdom. But alas, when the prince returned, full of ideas and disdain for Ferdinand, it became evident that things had changed at the Royal University. It had started accepting students based on merit rather than their upbringing and engaging professors with ideas. Why, he had even heard that Charles had studied under a false identity so he could experience his schooling like a commoner instead of the privileged royal that he was. Ferdinand had suggested to George that his son return home at once when word came that riots near the university had taken place. Let the boy be a boy, the king had said. What are they rioting about anyway? Taxes, Ferdinand had responded automatically. Taxes, the king frowned. What about? Did we raise them recently? No, the duke had lied, when in fact he had authorized a 20% increase in taxes, and during a particularly harsh winter at that. The people had been angry before because there was no food. Now the new taxes were meant to discourage the people from rebelling against the kingdom, but they seemed to have had an opposite effect. So while borrowing the king's royal seal to hide his error, the duke had sent a garrison of troops to quell the rebellion. How relieved he'd been when the entire catastrophe disappeared. Until months later, when the prince, newly returned home after finally completing his studies, brought it up during the council meeting. Charles's conduct had been a terrible surprise. The prince unwilling to listen to reason and logic, King George had immediately asked his son to join him in listening to the day's proceedings. But the first thing Charles did was criticize the council's composition. All of your advisers and lords, the prince had said, lashing out. They're men I vouch for, replied the duke, keeping his temper in check. Men who have served the council honorably since before you were born. They're men with only their best interests at heart. Men who are willing to extort the poor until they have nothing left. I was there during the riots when the new tax was imposed. I'll never forget them. Confusion had etched itself on the king's features. Ferdinand, you told me we hadn't raised taxes. Only by an insignificant amount, the Grand Duke blustered. Thank heavens at that moment he remembered the king's plans to throw a ball. Perhaps we should discuss the ball. The ball? Charles asked, perplexed. King George's expression brightened. Yes, my boy, I'm throwing you a ball to celebrate your homecoming. Everyone will be talking about it for years. That isn't necessary, father. I'm sure I'll be able to greet everyone at the court soon enough. Besides, should we even be throwing lavish parties when there is so much suffering outside the palace? Everyone is invited, said the Duke testily, not just the gentry. Everyone? Yes, everyone. Every eligible maiden that was. That had been enough to appease the prince. The Duke had been naive to think that this was the end of his troubles with Charles, that perhaps the king had been right. Find a girl for the prince and let him settle down. But no. Then came this calamity of the runaway princess. If only he had been able to identify her earlier so he could send her off somewhere. Then again, perhaps it wasn't too late for that. Ferdinand, the king was saying, are you listening to me? The duke's head bobbled up. Of course I am. I was saying, George said, his nose twitching as he absently held his side. Perhaps we should shift the band on magic. Perhaps that was rash, motivated by grief in an attempt to control something we could not. But your majesty, don't you remember what the fairies did? You cannot forgive and forget. The nation will think you're weak and you blame the fairies, Ferdinand, you and your father. I was never convinced it was their fault, and now I wonder whether it's time to let bygones be bygones. Ferdinand struggled to conceal his shock. Lift the ban on magic and Aurelius? He couldn't even fathom the chaos that would bring. Trying to hide his dismay, he cleared his throat again loudly. I'll add it to the list of items to discuss at the next council meeting, sire. Good. I know I can trust you. The king sniffled, grimacing at what must have been another pain in his side. It's something I've been thinking about recently, after a long while of not thinking about it. Perhaps for the best, sire. But now that Genevieve is back, she used to talk my ears off all the time about fairies and such, how she always wanted to meet one. Her husband, Yes, I remember the Duke of Orleans, Ferdinand cut in. He was always a proponent of magic. Maybe he had a point. Maybe I was too hasty banishing. Magic does not solve the problems of everyday life, Ferdinand said sensibly. Yes, yes, I know. But sometimes wonder brings happiness. I'd like to witness something wonderful before I go. He closed his eyes, his head sinking into his pillow. He looks paler, and his eyes are sunken in, Ferdinand thought. Your Majesty, are you quite well? Well, of course I'm well. The king adjusted his sleeping cap to prevent it from falling off his head. I would have been better if you hadn't interrupted my sleep. The moonlight cast a ghostly light upon George's wan skin, and for a moment, seeing the king look so ill, Ferdinand felt a prickle of guilt, a tiny prickle. The duke shrugged it away. Ruling a kingdom required a firm hand. Guilt and regret were for the weak. I thought the news of Charles's runaway princess would be important to you. Ha! Backtracking already, aren't we? You used to be a better liar, Ferdinand. Ferdinand did not reply. It was true, he had been a better liar. Now he was simply better at hiding his thoughts. A useful skill cultivated over many years, and one King George had never suspected. Fetch a decree for me, Ferdinand. Which decree, your Majesty? The Grand Duke tapped the king's shoulder. Your Majesty. George's hooded eyes blinked open. It's inside my desk, third drawer on the right. You'll see it right away. The Duke did as he was told. A crisp piece of parchment paper slid out of the drawer. Ferdinand caught sight of the first line, and it was all he needed to see. By royal decree, the magical persons are no longer expelled from Aurelius. It's already been signed, continued George from the other side of the room. I want you to give it to Charles before the next meeting with the council. Won't you be there? I'll be in the back taking a nap. Another cough. Let it be the first one he presides over. Shouldn't I be the one to preside over the council in your absence? Ferdinand wanted to ask. It'd been he who had headed the council meetings over the past 20 years. The prince had only attended a handful, and maybe only one or two when he was actually old enough to understand what was going on. But Ferdinand again wisely did not voice his thoughts. He crossed his hands behind his back. I thought I should inform you, sire, your son is planning to hold a third ball this week, with the intent of proposing to the sorceress. The king's eyelids drooped, and he began to snore. Did you hear me, sire? What was that? Ah, yes, another ball. Excellent. George wagged a warning finger at the Duke. If you do anything to ruin his chance with that girl, well, you know what'll happen. He crossed his arms and tucked himself deeper into his sheets. Now go away. It's the middle of the night, and I need my rest. The Duke bowed, carefully maintaining his composure. Then I take my leave, your Majesty. Good night. The king was already snoring. Ferdinand closed his eyes, envisioning what would happen the next morning. Dr. Coase would arrive just before breakfast, and his Majesty would learn that his illness had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. Ferdinand would be there to comfort him. His Majesty would reason that he should abdicate earlier than expected, and Ferdinand would smoothly convince him that he would aid the prince in ruling Aurelius. He'd even have the king put it down in writing. Such thoughts soothed his anxious mind as he exited the king's apartments. If things did not go as planned, it could end up disastrous. First, King George didn't seem at all displeased that Charles was planning to wed a servant. And now he wanted to welcome magic back into Aurelius? Indeed, something had to be done, and Ferdinand had an idea just where to begin. He crumpled the king's decree into his pocket. Then he turned toward the south wing, heading for the servants' quarters. Should there be any threat to the future of Aurelius, eliminate it immediately, his father had taught him, before it grows. He knew the root of his problem well enough, but eliminating it would be tricky, very tricky. Ferdinand sniffed. Fortunately, he was up to the challenge. He would find a way to get rid of Cinderella if it was the last thing he did.